The U.S. military has acknowledged killing civilians in its Thursday air raid near the northern Afghan city of Qunduz.
Every indication that we have right now is that the Taliban were firing on these friendly forces, and every part of this was to defend those friendly forces. And what we know is that we've had Afghans who have been martyred, had Afghans who were wounded, Afghan soldiers, and we've had American soldiers who were killed.
The U.S. military spokesman, however, repeated the claim that the U.S. airstrike aimed to help Afghan forces who were battling the Taliban. At least 32 people, including babies and children, were killed and dozens were wounded in the bombing of the village of Buz in the Qunduz district. The commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan has said that an initial probe suggested the strike was likely caused civilian deaths. In a statement, General John Nicholson regretted the loss of innocent lives and pledged to carry out an investigation to determine the facts. Local Afghans have called for justice, accusing U.S. forces of intentionally targeting civilians. Amnesty International has also called for an inquiry into the incident. We now go live to the Australian city of Brisbane to talk to Max Igan, radio host and political commentator. Mr. Igan, thank you so much for being with us. What do you think of the U.S. reaction to the latest incident in Afghanistan, which has claimed so many innocent civilian lives?
Look, it's a predictable reaction, it's a knee-jerk reaction, but ultimately you've got to look at what the US actions are in these places. There seems to be a policy of targeting civilians, and it doesn't seem to be any sort of surprise in this, and it doesn't seem to be by accident. This is what they've been doing in Syria, it's what they've been doing in Libya, it's what they've been doing in Afghanistan, what they've been doing in Iraq. You know, the United States needs to stop helping people because it's not helping. By dropping bombs on villages indiscriminately does not help anybody. And you know, they are the ones who are responsible for most of the instability we see in all of these countries anyway. They've gone in there basically for regime change in just about all of these places. You know, it's been the guise of going in there and fighting terrorism, but it's not. All they'd be doing is escalating the conflict. And these sorts of actions create terrorists because they create people who wish to react to the fact that their family was just blown up. This is just typical US foreign policy, which seems to be drop as many bombs as you can and drop them anywhere that they can fit.
Exactly, and it seems like one questions the fact if they really care about civilian lives in the countries they are involved in militarily, such as in Afghanistan. For instance, we have seen on so many cases the loss of civilians in what has been called by the US either as a mistake or in drone attacks, or in this case an airstrike that it claims was actually to help Afghan forces and its forces in the battle against the Taliban. Why do these incidents keep happening without anything being really done to prevent them?
Because that's just US foreign policy. The policy is to go there and to destabilize these countries. It's not about defeating anybody. It's not about defeating terrorists. If you look at the terrorist armies that are overrunning all of these places, they're all a result of US foreign policy right from the ground up to begin with. We wouldn't have any of this instability in the Middle East if it wasn't for US foreign policy and those who control US foreign policy. So this is just typical of them. They're not interested in doing anything that they say they're doing. What it's about is regime change. They want to make sure that there are good puppet governments in all of these countries, and anybody who isn't abiding by their wishes, they'll just bomb them. And they like to just keep bombing them anyway to keep the war going. That's what it's about mainly, is keeping the war going. I mean, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, these could have been mopped up years ago. I mean, they shouldn't have happened to begin with, but they could have been mopped up years ago. Only the United States has been pouring massive amounts of weapons and funds in there and just dropping bombs indiscriminately everywhere they can and creating a massive amount of instability. The only way we're going to see any peace in the region is when the US butts out and stops dropping bombs and stops supplying these terrorist armies with weapons.
And something that the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan has said, General John Nicholson, he has pledged to carry out an investigation to determine the facts. In his words, we have seen such investigations being carried out in the past, such probes, or at least promised to be carried out. Do you think anything good will come out of such probes and investigations?
No, there won't. These are just theatre for the masses. This is just done to appease the people, to appease the voices that are screaming out for these atrocities. Oh, yes, we'll look into it. But it's always them investigating themselves. And so, of course, they never really find anything wrong. Or they find it was a clerical error, not me, someone in my office, whatever, you know. They just make up excuses. We won't see anything come of it. These investigations lead nowhere. They're just good to put in the headlines.
And one final question. What is the role of the central governments in these countries, for instance, in the case of the story we're talking about, Afghanistan, in preventing such attacks, in stopping the U.S. from being involved and having a military presence in their country?
Well, that's the difficult thing, because you can tell the United States to go and they just don't seem to want to leave is the problem. And the other problem is that all of the terrorists that they're funding are being supplied by these people. You know, this whole terrorist rampage that's going through the Middle East, all these Daesh that are everywhere, this is all the result of US foreign policy. So the governments in these places, I mean, we need some sort of solidarity from the people, but the governments in all of these countries need to band together and say they've had enough of the United States helping them, because it's the United States' help that has created all of these problems and all these issues to begin with.
Okay, Max Igan, radio host and political commentator, joining us via Skype out of Brisbane, Australia. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.